worry about the working of the PDS and how to efficiently distribute this food grains to the poor people. Food subsidy is too much. If the people are getting at 1 rupee, 2 rupee rice and wheat, then what is the implication for farmers' incentives for production?
The government's ambitious food security bill has now got a cabinet nod after much delay and is ready to be introduced to the parliament for clearance. On We Mean Business tonight, we deliberate whether the bill in its current form is worth being passed. Does it set out to accomplish what it intends to do, and if not, is it worth burdening the government's finances with such largesse at a time when the top worry of the finance minister seems to be the fiscal deficit? We'll also debate how smooth the ride would be in the parliament for this bill given the hot political climate, and whether the opposition parties will let the legislation go through and have the Congress hog all the credit ahead of the elections. Joining me on the debate tonight, Reetika Khera, Associate Professor, Institute of Economic Growth; Devinder Sharma, Food Policy Analyst, joins us from Chandigarh; Aditi Phadnis, Political Editor of the Business Standard; and Brinda Jagirdar, Independent Economist, joins us here in our Mumbai studios. She was, of course, formerly with the State Bank of India. Before we begin our discussion, though, I had a chance to speak to noted economist YK Alagh, who's done some seminal work on this area, and I began by asking him what his critical concerns were about the final provisions of this bill and whether he feels it should go through in this current form.
This is a very difficult kind of objective to meet because, basically what happens is that what are called the chronically undernourished are around, on an average, around a fifth of the population. Although in some segments of the population and in some areas, for example, girls and women in some backward regions, it can be much higher. Generally, the experience has been that you want extensive coverage, otherwise the really hungry get left out. But on the other hand, the entitlement should be more restrictive. So you are it's a difficult objective to meet, and I have a lot of sympathy with what the government is doing. One of the things we have to remember is that very poor people also now don't only require grain. And the nutrition aspect, for example, a glass of milk to a lactating mother will probably be far more important, and maybe even some animal husbandry products, because a large number of the malnourished are really castes which are not vegetarian, so an egg maybe or something like that. Now, so therefore if you have just a large coverage and don't concentrate on the really hungry, the legislation does provide that the states can supplement what the center is doing. But the way the fiscal situation at the state level is, I'd be highly surprised if the states tend to develop what I would call a nutrition package rather than a grain package.
Right, so but the Antodaya Anna Yojana continues. So does that in some sense address at least the concern partially of not having universal coverage? I know we still have to talk about, the non-grain side of it, but at least in terms of the universal coverage, does that Yojana in some sense address that concern?
I'm not quite sure because, the Antyodaya program is somewhat selective and not every state follows it. And the problem has been that, if you don't have universal coverage, there is a lot of experience to show. I think I've talked about it with data. Abhijit Sen has a paper with Himanshu which shows that if you don't have extensive coverage, the really poor get left out. It's more a social kind of thing. In the sense that if you go to a village, until we had the Manrega, basically the residents of the Kabirwada would not even be there when you are discussing things in the Chaupal. So they tend to get left out. And Antyodaya has these objectives, but yet we know survey after survey, 18 to 20% of the population is malnourished. Now that's, India can afford to lick that problem. So I think the attempt is in the right direction. But if you just give grain to a very large number of people, that then, is not really solving the hunger problem.
Right, so with this, whole idea for universal coverage, is that in some sense a bit utopian? Because that would then bring about the questions of us having enough grains. Also, can we afford increased outlays at this point in time? Because that would put pressure on the fiscal deficit, which the government clearly cannot afford right now.
I think we should start in any case. As you know, Nikhil, I mean, when we start these things, they start in a very, very small plane. I mean, Manrega started on a very small plane. I mean, it takes time for the states to mobilize themselves. These things take time. I mean, I am not very critical of the fact that Mr. Chidambaram has only provided 10,000 crores additional to all the other programs that you've talked about. It takes time to gear up and to get these things organized. So, beginning this year seems okay. I don't think that you'll start, the big pressure will come this year or not even next year. But sooner or later, I think you'll have to worry about things like, let's look at it this way. If you give everybody 3 kilos or 5 kilos of grain, I mean, my wife or your family, what will they do? They are much too bright to let this opportunity go. They'll buy the grain and they'll sell it back in the market. And therefore, there will be some kind of an equilibrium, apart from the fact that the state will have a loss. But, I mean, I don't see people consuming that much of grain. So, but its fiscal effects, if it is not targeted and is very widespread and is largely only grain, well, I think then it's not just a fiscal effect, it's also the agriculture effect, and we need to worry about these things. What I suspect is that many of these things will iron themselves out through time. On balance of considerations, as they say, maybe I'm an optimistic kind of lighter, but I think we should start the whole process.
Right. And so let's then now come to the point that you raised on the fact that non-cereals are not part of the act. Would that, are you worried that that would in some sense propel farmers to further produce cash crops and ignore non-cereals, which is really where food inflation is coming from, your eggs and vegetables and fruits?
Well, I mean, if you only keep it grain and you're going to shove in the grain anyway, whether people want it or not, then obviously you'll have to give high incentives for that. And the farmer is clever. If you raise the price, he'll keep on producing that. So that will have, I've modeled these alternatives for Indian agriculture, and really over an 8-10 year period, if you diversify agriculture, if you grow, put in infrastructure, first stage processing, then in fact poverty goes down faster, because agricultural growth of that kind is, very poverty alleviating. This year, the economic survey also carries some calculations from the World Bank to that effect. I mean, we've done these things 3-4 years earlier. So there are those dangers. But, I think correctives set in pretty soon. And the corrective should be that ultimately we should end up targeting more. What are called the leakages should become much less. And we should start giving the vulnerable population something a little more than grains. That will balance the whole. Please remember that the income elasticity of demand for non-grains amongst the poor population is quite high. I mean, these are not air conditioners. Very poor people drink milk, they eat eggs, and, sooner or later, I think that will have to be factored in by things like, as you said, the Antyodaya or versions of that kind, which will have to focus the food security program.